Welcome to the Myths of Mass Incarceration and Overpolicing. Please welcome Cully Stimpson, Senior Legal Fellow and Deputy Director in the Heritage Foundation's Meese Center for Legal and Judicial Studies.
Well, welcome everybody to the Heritage Foundation, and for those of you online here in person, and then those who've joined us on C-SPAN. We're delighted to have you, and I'm really delighted and honored to welcome to Heritage two friends and really giants in the criminal justice policy world. Dr. Barry Latzer on my far left and Rafael Manguel. Barry is Professor Emeritus at the John Jay College of Criminal Justice at the City College of New York. He has a law degree and a PhD and is the author of countless articles, blogs, papers, and influential books, including The Rise and Fall of Violent Crime in America, and his latest book, published last year, called The Myth of Overpunishment, A Defense of the American Justice System and a Proposal to Reduce Incarceration While Protecting the Public. Rafael Manguel is the Nick O'Neill Fellow and Head of Research for the Policing and Public Safety Initiative at the Manhattan Institute, a contributing editor of City Journal, and a member of the Council on Criminal Justice. He holds a BA from City University of New York and a JD from DePaul University. He, too, has written extensively about criminal justice matters, and his first book, published last year, is called Criminal Injustice, What the Push for Decarceration and Depolicing Gets Wrong and Who It Hurts the Most. Now, the format for today's event, which will last an hour, is a moderated discussion for about 45 minutes, followed by your questions and questions we receive online. So, with that, let's get started. And Barry, I want to start with you. Your latest book has two parts. The first part is a short history of punishment in America, and then the age of leniency, and I want to focus on the latter part because that's appropriate for our topic today. In a chapter called The Buildup, you write about, quote, the Titanic crime wave, unquote, that struck the United States with the force of a tsunami in the late 1960s, and that went on for about 30 years. And you noted that between 1970 and 1995, there were more people murdered in this country than soldiers killed in World War II, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and the conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan combined. And you also noted that fewer than 1 million service personnel suffered non-fatal injuries in that same time combined, yet 2.2 million Americans per year were injured by violent crime during that time frame. So as a result of that indisputable crime wave, what did the states do, and what was the result?
At first, they did nothing, Cully. They were overwhelmed. There were so many crimes, police couldn't apprehend enough people fast enough. When they arrested them, the courts were overwhelmed with cases, didn't know how to handle it. The sentences, the time served, actually went down. It took a decade for the system to rebuild, over a decade, into the 70s, into the 80s, before the system could restore its capacity to handle this crime tsunami. And believe me, I lived through it, so I remember it. I'm old enough to remember what it was really like. And just before we went on, Ralph and I were talking about how crime is now in the subways. And whatever it is now was a heck of a lot worse back then. It was really, really frightening. And of course, the big cities were losing tourism. People didn't want to come to the city anymore, right? And therefore the restaurants were losing money. The venues for entertainment were going down. They were in trouble. I mean, the United States was under siege. And that's why it's remarkable to me that you don't have bunches of books on the crime wave, and you actually have people who deny that there was a crime wave. That is simply unbelievable to me. That's the ostrich approach to social problems, right? If I put my head in the sand, maybe it'll go away.
Let me pick up on a word you used. You said the system. And talk to us about how there's not really a system. There's 18,000 police departments around the country. There's 2,300 elected DAs. There's 50 states. There's thousands of counties. Put more words around that, because it's not a system all walked in lockstep.
Yeah. And of course, that's why it's so hard to turn it around, right? We're not talking about even one big ship. We're talking about multiple systems, and they're largely locally controlled or state controlled. So the prisons are state controlled, the cops are largely municipality run, and so you can't turn the whole thing around at once. That's not going to happen in the United States. But you can turn things around eventually. That's why there was this lag. That's why it needed a decade or more before we recovered our capacity to deal with this crime tsunami.
Well, let's pick up on the lag, because you describe the lag between crime rising and imprisonment rates.
Yes.
And you explain that lag has happened twice now since then.
Yes.
Put more words around what the lag means and what we should think about it.
Well, the critics of imprisonment, of course, love to point out that the imprisonment rates were real low in the late 60s, early 70s. True, right? And they soared going into the 80s. True. But this was the response to the crime tsunami, of course. And it took that long a time to develop that kind of response. This is nothing that you can do in a short run. But that was necessitated by the big crime rise. That's why you had to have this rise in imprisonment. So, of course, there's a huge lag. Crime keeps rising, late 60s, early 70s, mid-70s, and the capacity of the system to deal with it doesn't go like that. It takes a decade or more before it could deal with it. So eventually, the imprisonment rates do rise. They rise quite high, okay? But that's because it's responding to the crime wave.
And I want to bring you into this, Raphael, but you also go into great detail in your book about what many of the states did. They talked, they had legislative proposals, some passed, some didn't, some that passed, they realized it didn't go far enough. Then they had to build out the capacity for the prisons in the state system. So inevitably, because those folks over there on the Hill, they take a long time to get things done sometimes, these state legislatures were chewing through all of this. Is that part of the problem?
Sure. Well, yes, sure. But the federal government created incentives, truth in sentencing law, for instance, mandatory minimum laws. The federal government created incentives for the states to act. So that did help put things on the right track. But again, it's up to each state legislature to do the job when it comes to imprisonment. New York built a slew of prisons back then. There was a huge rise in the number of prisons in the United States. Now, of course, the left generally deplores this now. They say, oh, that's awful, mass incarceration. But this didn't happen because of nothing. This happened because of a huge something that terrified the American public.
Jump in here.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's really interesting about that is that despite the fact that there was this lag between the buildup of incarceration in the United States and the sort of rise in crime, you can go back to the mid-1970s and sort of follow the public debates, and what you'll find is that even then, people who were sort of left-of-center reform advocates were criticizing what they essentially characterized as mass incarceration back then. I mean, you can go back and read James Q. Wilson's Thinking About Crime, which was first published in 1975, where he's essentially responding to the same sorts of arguments that we're hearing today about the need to cut down on the punitive response to crime, to invest in rehabilitation, and he was one of sort of, the foremost advocates kind of pushing back on that, even in the mid-1970s. And so what that tells us about today is that, whatever level of decarceration we've been able to achieve in the last 10, 15 years, whatever level of decarceration we achieve in the next 10, 15 years, what you can expect is that, critics of the system are never going to be fully satisfied. And that, I think, poses one of the most significant dangers to people who are stuck living in the enclaves where crime is highest.
And that's why we wrote our books, basically. I mean, it wasn't a conspiracy, by the way. We each wrote independently. But that's why we wrote our books, because I kept reading about all this mass incarceration, mass incarceration. What are they talking about? I mean, you got to look at the numbers. You have to deal with the realities, the statistical realities. How long do prisoners serve in the United States? Don't tell me about the 40-year sentence. I want to know how long they're actually behind bars. Answer, 2 years or less. 2/3 of them are out in 2 years or less. That doesn't sound so awful to me. I once was in a debate with a professor, and he said, 2 years, that's a long prison sentence. I didn't have the presence of mind. I should have said, yeah, for a guy like you, that would be a very long prison sentence, right? You're just a weak professor, that's all. You couldn't take it. If you were a tough street guy, you could take it. In fact, you could take it on one leg.
Yeah. There's just such an incongruity between the reality on the ground that's illustrated by the data, as Barry notes, and what the narrative is that really drives the reform agenda, right? I mean, we hear terms like mass incarceration. We hear terms like second chances, right? We have Second Chance Month in the United States, and the whole idea behind this is that our country systematically denies people the ability to have a second crack, a second bite at the apple, a second chance, and this pretends as if someone, gets caught smoking a joint and then they're doing a 30-year prison sentence. The reality is just the opposite. If you look at the typical person in a state prison, what you're going to find is someone who has between 10 and 12 prior arrests and between 5 and 6 prior convictions, right? These are not people who are being denied second chances. We're giving people multiple bites at the apple. And what I really wrote my book to help the public understand is that with every bite at the apple that we give a repeat offender, we're essentially rolling the dice. But we're not rolling the dice with our own lives. We're rolling the dice with the lives of people who are stuck living in places where the national crime numbers, don't even come close to representing how dangerous, day-to-day life truly is. There was a mention of the fatalities and casualties in the recent wars. There are parts of this country, neighborhoods, 10, 15 block, radius areas where the homicide rate is significantly higher than your chances of dying on battlefields in Iraq and Afghanistan or even in the Ukraine today.
Yeah.
So, and imagine, a mother's fear of sending her child off, to the Marines in 2002, what that would be like. And now try to imagine living in a place like West Garfield Park, Chicago, which in 2019 had a homicide rate of 131 per 100,000, which makes it one of the most dangerous places, not just in the country, but in the world, where if you are a young male, your chances of being killed are about on par with your chances of, going to graduate school. And so, that's really what I wanted people to understand from my book, is that, despite the fact that all of these reforms are pushed in the name of equity, are pushed in the name of racial justice and social justice, the reality is that the most persistent and starkest disparities that we see in this country in the criminal justice world come in the form of victimization.
So, as you both know, we've been writing about progressive prosecutors, and we did a bunch of stuff. We have a book coming out in March. We did 2 symposia. We did a short video about a career criminal, Austin Davidson. The Wicomico County Sheriff right here is Mike Lewis. One of his deputy sheriffs was killed by a career criminal who had 29 interactions with law enforcement before he murdered Deputy Sheriff Hilliard. And he was on probation for armed robbery and had 4 open warrants in Maryland when they went to pick him up, and he killed. So this is your typical career criminal. Yeah. But let me go back, Barry, because I want to set the stage for a more granular discussion about some of the things you both each write about in your book. Imprisonment lags the crime wave. The crime wave peaked around 92, 93, and then it started going down drastically. You don't really hear about it going down because people don't want to acknowledge that the imprisonment, as much as it's distasteful and necessary, worked. Yeah. And the alternatives to incarceration, the specialty courts and all the rest of it helped drive down violent crime and property crime. Sure. And you have a slide in your book, and if we could pull up the slide, I think it would be helpful to see that this is a Pew Research slide that shows that how that actually worked, and it's been going down dramatically for about 30 years. Talk more about that.
Well, that's the second leg. You mentioned that earlier. I didn't respond to you, but that's the second leg between imprisonment and crime. The first one was crime was rising and high, and it took a long time before the system was able to build itself back up. The second leg is that crime is now receding, and the punishment system is still pretty potent, pretty powerful. So, of course, the left criticizes the second leg and ignores the first leg, right? They only want to tell you about the terribly high imprisonment rate and ignore the first leg when the system didn't respond to the crime rise. Well, of course, the second leg and the first leg are both reflective of the same issue, and that is it's hard to steer the big ship around, and it's really the same kind of problem. But if we do decarcerate, and we do it in an irrational way, like just releasing people arbitrarily, not prosecuting misdemeanors as some of these progressive prosecutors are not only proposing but doing, if we do this kind of arbitrary release of offenders, well, what we're inviting, of course, is another crime wave. It's kind of obvious. Weakness in the criminal justice system was not the only factor explaining the rise of crime in the late 60s, but it was a key factor. So if we weaken the system, we run the risk of inspiring another crime wave. This was the late Eric Monkenon's theory. You know, he said, when we go all permissive, when we become too lenient, that encourages more crime. Then we toughen up, and crime goes down, and the cycle continues that way. So his theory could well be borne out if we keep weakening the criminal justice system. And we've seen this weakening in the last, decade at least, right?
And Rafe, the second part of your subtitle, and who it hurts the most, you say in your book about the geographical and demographic concentration of crime, and you note that in New York City, since at least 2008, around 95% of the city's shooting victims have been either black or Hispanic, and that while blacks constitute 13.4% of the population, they make up more than 53% of the nation's homicide victims in 2020.
Yeah.
Talk more about that.
And by the way, that's typical. That's
exactly
not just
right.
2020. I have data going back to the beginning of the 20th century reflecting that same thing.
Yeah, I mean, the reason that I wanted to spend so much time on the concentration of crime as an issue is because, there's sort of an understandable colloquialism that prevails in this country, and that is to talk about crime in national terms or in broad geographic terms. You hear about Chicago crime or New York crime or, U.S. crime. And the reality is that the vast majority of the United States is as safe as the safest places in the world. What we have that lots of other places don't are these pockets of very highly concentrated crime, places like West Garfield Park, Chicago, right? In the book, I do this analysis where I pick out the 10 most dangerous neighborhoods in the city of Chicago and the 10 safest neighborhoods in the city of Chicago. The 10 safest neighborhoods had a collective homicide rate of about 1.6 or 1.8 per 100,000, and they had 200,000 more residents than the 10 most dangerous neighborhoods, which had a collective homicide rate in excess of 61 per 100,000. And again, some of those neighborhoods within that collection had homicide rates that were double that. And so, what we have to understand is that crime concentrates at the very hyper-local level. If you take New York City as an example, 3.5% of our street segments in a given year. A street segment, if you're thinking of a city block, would be one side of the block, both sidewalks, so corner to corner, two sidewalks. They see 50% of all the violent crime. 1% of our street segments see 25% of all the violent crime. Now, why is it important to understand this? Why is it important to understand this in the context of the demographic concentration of crime? Well, one major reason is that we know that the reform debate is driven in large part by concerns about racial disparities in the system, racial disparities in enforcement. But if the reality is that crime concentrates geographically in very, very small places, and certain demographic groups are overrepresented in those places, well, if the system, if policing, for example, is responsive to that phenomenon, then that is by definition going to generate disparities in enforcement. And you have to contextualize those disparities in light of the reality of crime concentration in order to fully understand what's happening. It is not evidence of racism that you have, quote unquote, overrepresentation of certain groups in the enforcement data. It's evidence of responsiveness on the part of the system to a dire problem. I'm still a relatively young guy, but I'm old enough to remember that one of the harshest critiques leveled against policing in the early 1990s and late 1980s was that it wasn't responsive enough to black crime. Right? I don't know how many hip hop fans are in the audience, but you got Public Enemy, 911 is a Joke was a big hit, and the whole idea was that policing as an institution didn't care about black on black crime. They didn't care about the carnage. They didn't care about the victimization. Well, the use of data to inform the deployment of police resources, which was a huge innovation in this country, changed that. It made the system responsive. And when crime went down, it didn't go down for everyone equally. If you look at the homicide decline from 1990 to 2014, it added a full year of life expectancy to the average black man's life in this country. It only added 0.14 years of life expectancy to the average white man. And the reason I bring that up is to pose a rhetorical question to the people who would really lean into the enforcement disparities. And I would ask them, why on earth would a system allegedly designed and operated for the specific oppression of certain groups so disproportionately benefit those very groups when the system achieves its stated ends? As stated by whom? As stated by the people at the system's helms. Ask any police executive, any traditional law and order prosecutor in this country, what is it that you want to achieve? How do you define success? They say by reducing crime. Well, who does that help? It's not rich white people, I can tell you that.
Right. And you're a road warrior. You're always out there debating. I'm sure you come up against thoughtful, intelligent people who take the opposing view. And when you ask them that rhetorical question, what answer do they have?
I mean, they deflect. They deflect. They say, of course, there are both costs and benefits, but maybe we're not weighing them the right way. And I think that's just, it's a cop-out, and frankly. At the end of the day, if we're weighing these problems against one another, I think that the concentration of serious violence in this country wins out 10 times out of 10 as the problem that should deserve the most attention.
Facts are stubborn things.
They are.
In your book, I really like the section, because you went to law school in Chicago.
Yep.
And all of a sudden, when you're in Chicago and you're seeing what's going around, you're like, huh.
Mm-hmm.
And you wrote about that, and you looked at very distinct micro areas in Chicago, and then looked at the data to see where the murders were happening and the crime was happening.
Right.
And I hope people get your book and look at that, because you can't deny what the facts are there. Barry, you wanted to jump in.
No, I was just going to say that that's absolutely the case. Just talk about who the crime victims are, and that really changes the conversation, or it should. But it doesn't. They'll say, the critics of Routh's narrative will say, well, 38% of the prisoners are black, and that's 3 times the black population of the United States.
And why is that?
That's true.
Why is that?
That is true. Well, there are 2 answers. And one is clearly wrong. The first answer is that it's racism. That's clearly wrong. The second part of that is to say that it's the war on drugs. That was Michelle Alexander's argument. That's also clearly wrong.
Well, I want to get into that
What's
because
right is that it was violent crime in the black population that put those people in the prison in the first place.
Yeah, I want to pick up on the Michelle Alexander. The New Jim Crow is her book.
Yeah.
Because you really go right at her in your book, and in a respectful way, but you cite a lot of things, and I want to get into that in a minute. But Raphael, back to you. You said in your book just 2% of U.S. counties see about 50% of U.S. murders in a given year, and 54% of counties in the U.S. don't see any murders in a given year. We wrote a paper as a rebuttal, because there was, this red state crime murder problem, right? And we realized, well, that's odd, because first off, you don't look at state rates, you look at granular rates. And so we found out and looked at the data and realized it's actually a blue city murder problem.
Exactly right.
And who's running those cities, and of the top 30 cities, almost half have Soros bought and paid for rogue prosecutors. There's all sorts of issues. And so you can't really overlay the politics on this. You have to see where the crime is actually happening. What did you learn from writing this book that you haven't shared with us so far, about the geographical and demographic concentration of crime?
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of what I haven't shared already, it's that it is probably the single biggest driver of the disparities in enforcement. It is also, I think, it tells us quite a bit about other policy debates as well. I mean, there are lots of debates about, for example, the role that socioeconomic factors plays as a root cause of crime. Well, those socioeconomic factors are much more prevalent in broader society than crime is as a phenomenon, right? And there's a disconnect in this argument, because if, in fact, something like poverty causes crime, well, then you would expect to see crime not so concentrated where it is, because poverty is a much broader phenomenon. Gun ownership is another one, right? People tie, well, we have so many guns in our society, therefore that informs why our crime rate is so much higher than the other Western European democracies that we're so often unfavorably compared to. But again, the vast majority of the United States is as safe as any part of those Western European democracies. What's different is that we have places like North Philadelphia and Southwest Baltimore, and the west side of Chicago, and the parts of St. Louis that are still struggling with incredibly high homicide rates. And that's a very unique problem that requires a unique approach. This idea that there's a one-size-fits-all sort of answer to these questions is wrong, because we don't have a sort of one-size crime problem. These things are very, very unique. They're very, very hyper-concentrated, and in order to understand them, we have to take a hyper-localized approach, but that doesn't make for a really good and sexy narrative.
Let me play devil's advocate.
Sure.
Okay, and I'm doing this just to draw something out of you, and that's the disconnect that you talk about and write about in your book between violent crime and socioeconomic indicators like poverty, unemployment. And you talked about it, but plain devil's advocate, if we just invest more in these communities, if we just give more public housing, give more to the communities there, crime will go down.
Yeah.
Your research doesn't show that, does it?
No. I mean, well, think about the trillions of dollars that we've spent on anti-poverty programs in this country over the years. I mean, that doesn't seem to be helping the many places in this country where crime is literally at record levels. I mean, we have more than 24 cities that have seen homicide rates either reach record levels, all-time highs, or come close to all-time highs. Right? I mean, places like Philadelphia, which set a homicide record 2 years ago and came close to breaking it in 2022.
Stop right there, because
Sure.
I've got a slide for you.
Yeah.
Go ahead and pull this up. These are Chicago homicides by year. You can see a long time ago, Barry, this is from your book, of course, that they were down. And then about 2015, 2016, they start going back up. In Chicago, it's not coincidentally the first year that Kim Foxx, the rogue prosecutor, was elected. But go to Philadelphia, the next slide, to your point. Shootings per year in Philadelphia, through the roof.
Yeah.
Homicides, go to the next slide. There you go. So keep going.
Yeah.
Well, let me address the poverty issue for just 1 second,
Sure.
because there's a fascinating study just came out a few months ago, done by Columbia University, and they were talking about the poverty of Chinese Americans in New York City. And they found that the poverty rate, this is kind of astonishing, everyone thinks about Asian millionaires, right? The poverty rate among Chinese in New York City was higher than the black poverty rate. It was something like 23% in poverty and about 19% for African Americans. So I said, wow, that's pretty surprising. What about the arrest rate for homicides? So I did a little digging, found NYPD data, and guess what I found? The arrest rate for homicides among Chinese New Yorkers was like 1.2 per 100,000. Among the black population, it was over 10 per 100,000. Whoa! So you have this group with very high poverty rates and pretty low violent crime rates. Isn't that inconsistent with the narrative? It's totally inconsistent with the narrative that poverty is the big driver. So giving out more money in anti-poverty programs, I don't think is the solution here. Here we have a high poverty group with very low violent crime rates.
Right. And not only do we have that crime adversity mismatch, which Barry just so expertly documents in The Rise and Fall of Violent Crime, which is a book I think everyone should read, but we also don't have a correlation between these measures over time, right? So take New York City, for example. In 1989, which is the year before homicides peaked at 2,262, the poverty rate in New York City was slightly lower than it was in 2016, which is the year before homicides hit their valley at 292. So the poverty rate ranges at around 20% for that entire period, and yet we have a 90% decline in homicides. We didn't see crime go up during the Great Recession in New York City. We didn't see it go up at the national level, right? You had a doubling of unemployment, yet the homicide rate declines by 15% between 2006 and 2010.
During the Great Depression, crime soared at first in the worst years of the Depression. But you know what? The Depression kept going after the 30s, right until almost the start of World War II. But crime sank. Violent crime went down in the second half of the Great Depression. How do you explain that, right? There's no consistent relationship between poverty either at the micro level or at the macro level and violent crime. So am I saying that more affluent people will do as much violent crime as less affluent? Absolutely not. I am not saying that at all. Affluent people have a very compelling incentive not to do violent crime. They're no good at it. Their lives would be ruined. They'd get pinched right away. They'd end up in prison. Their lives would be ruined. Their wives would leave them. They'd lose their jobs. But a young guy on the street who doesn't have a job anyway or doesn't show up for it, right? Whose devil-may-care attitude leads him to crime, what does he have to lose? What does he have to lose from engaging in violent crime? So my argument is, it's not so much that poverty drives violent crime, but rather that affluence drives down violent crime.
Can I add something here, because I know you're I think I know where you're headed. We had in our Rogue Prosecutor Symposia, we interviewed a city council member for Pico Rivera in LA. His name's Andrew Lara. He's a Democrat, very thoughtful guy, went to USC. He grew up in South Central LA. All his friends that he hung out with were gang members. He fortunately was given the opportunity to go across town to a different school, and he saw how the other side was brought up. And he decided, you know what, I'm either going to go this road, the bad road, or I'm going to go this road. And he made it. He made it out. But he talks about culture. Yeah. The culture of violence, he calls it. You picked up on that in your book. Talk about that.
Well, I mean, I think, and I think that the key point to weigh in on here, because, people on the other side of us in this debate will say, well, how do you explain if, in fact, poverty is unrelated to criminal offending? How do you explain the fact that so many offenders are poor? And what I think they're getting wrong is the direction in which the causation runs, right? Like, yes, it is true that a large portion of offenders are, people who either come from poverty or who come from relatively low socioeconomic status backgrounds. But that doesn't necessarily tell us that low socioeconomic status leads to crime. Why? Because we don't know which is causing which. It could very well be the case, and I think that it is, that the sort of attitudes that lead someone to think that crime is a good idea are also just not very conducive to economic success, which is why you see that relationship. But the thing to remember is that the vast majority of people, even in high crime, low income communities, are law abiding. So what that points to, what I think, Barry's work really, helped elucidate for a lot of people, is that the obvious answer here is that there is a cultural element to this. And it's something that I wanted to explore in my book. I mean, you can see references to it in popular culture. You can see references to it in, hip hop music, which I'm a big fan of, by the way. This is, not something that I, write derisively. But I think, we have to accept the reality that there is, and there's a long literature on this, that there is a prevailing quote unquote code of the street, to quote Elijah Anderson, who wrote, the sort of seminal ethnographic work on this. And that code of the street is associated with higher levels of criminal offending. And until you address those cultural issues, which, by the way, I'm not sure that the government is well positioned to do, we have to understand that there's a limit to what social spending can achieve if, in fact, these are cultural phenomena.
So in preparing for our time together today, I wanted to see what criticisms there were of your books, whether they took on your arguments head on and said, well, they got this wrong, they got this wrong, they got this wrong, and there were articles out there. I didn't find anything. Honestly, I found a couple little things, and you sort of did a rebuttal in one newspaper article, et cetera, but it was a minor point. These facts are out there. These crime rates, where it's happening. If you go to any big city or even smaller jurisdictions, you know where the crime is happening. Why? Why isn't there a tit for tat based on facts and direct refutation or attempt to refute what you're saying?
They'd rather ignore us. It's the best argument they have. They can't deal with the numbers. They can't refute the numbers. So they just ignore us. We're just marginalized. That's how this is handled. That's how the left handles books like ours.
I think also, though, they've been rewarded for sticking to the narrative. Narratives have proven to be incredibly effective at driving policy, at driving the public debate. There really is no incentive to, walk back from that, step back from what's working, and dig into the data. That's not a very sexy approach. It doesn't put butts in the seats. It doesn't, drive the tone of congressional hearings. It doesn't, lead to good press conferences. And so, as long as they continue to get rewarded for selling a powerful narrative, that is powerful, right? I mean, if you are, someone who's not familiar with this data, if you're just a well-meaning person sitting in a high school classroom being fed this, you want to help. You want to do something about that. It's natural to be upset and see injustice. The problem is that there is a very lopsided effort to frame this debate, and, pushing back against that is a pretty gargantuan task, as we're finding. But, we're doing the best that we can.
Well, let's get back to Mr. Pushback here, because you pushed back hard in your book, and you took on Michelle Alexander, who has a really popular book called The New Jim Crow. It's a national bestseller, and you call her out for her, quote, inflated and essentially dishonest definition of mass incarceration, unquote. You write that she, quote, equates mass incarceration with correctional control, even though the overwhelming majority of people under such control are at large in the community, unquote. And that's on page 89 and 90 of your book.
You mean I can't backpedal, right?
You're stuck. You're stuck. But tell us why you're right and she's wrong.
How can it be mass incarceration, Cully, if the guy's out on the street? He's not incarcerated. He's free. Okay, he's under correctional control. What does that mean? He's got a probation officer or a parole officer, and maybe he might even meet with him once in a while, right? But largely that's an honor system, isn't it? We're hoping that even though he's not an honorable man, he'll obey the law, which he usually won't, okay? That's the reality of it. So she says, Michelle Alexander, she says, but violent crime didn't cause mass incarceration. Drug war caused mass incarceration. Really? So I took the number of African Americans who were in prison for drug crimes, and I took the number of whites who were in prison for drug crimes and the number of Hispanics who were in prison for drug crimes, and I said, let's cull from that all of the inmates who are in for drug charges. And after you do that, what happens? The percentage of blacks in prison remains the same. It's still 38%. How can that be? If you pulled out all the drug offenders who are African American, you still have 38% black in prison? You do. You do. Do the numbers yourself, and you'll see what I mean, right? So it can't be that drug crimes are driving the incarceration. So when you define incarceration, let's talk about imprisonment, or at least being in jail. Let's not talk about being on the street on probation or parole. They may be under correctional control, but they're not incarcerated.
Yeah, and Michelle Alexander's book plays a lot of games with the drug war and its position. And there are a lot of things that I think the public is misled on. I mean, one example is that the drug war and the ramping up of it in the 1980s and 90s is sort of presented as this racist conspiracy. Things like the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986 are sort of pointed to as prima facie evidence that there was racism built into the law, because that law establishes the 100-to-1 sentencing disparity between crack and powder cocaine. And so the argument goes that, well, crack cocaine was more prominent in black communities, therefore, the over-punishment of crack cocaine relative to powder cocaine is clear evidence of bias. But if you go back and look into the legislative history, what you'll find is that 16 of the 19 members of the Congressional Black Caucus co-sponsored the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986. You can go and read.
They begged Reagan to pass that law. They begged them to pass that.
You can read editorials in black newspapers in Harlem at the time and just read the way that they talked about the local drug pushers. There was anger. The reason that crack cocaine was treated so much more harshly was that there was more violence associated with the crack trade than the powder cocaine trade. And the reality of it is, whether you think it's the right way to go about it or not, that the drug war is largely viewed by law enforcement as a pretextual attack on more serious violent crime, because they recognize that there's an overlap between people who engage in the drug trade and people who engage in more serious violent offenses. So when you look at the 14% of the state prison population serving time primarily for drugs, and you went into their criminal histories, what you're going to find are a lot of other violent offenses and property felonies. And if you look at the recidivism data, what you'll find is that more than a third of people who are released from prison after serving time primarily for drugs will be rearrested for at least one violent offense. 75% will be rearrested for a non-drug crime. That overlap is what really drove this conversation. And the last example I'll give here is, if you're sort of thinking about the sort of paradigmatic representative of the black community in Congress in the 1980s and 90s, think Charles Rangel, right, the congressman from Harlem. Well, in 1990, he debated white National Review founder William F. Buckley on the question of whether drugs should be legalized. And during that debate, Charles Rangel, black representative from Harlem, actually proposes life in prison for certain crack dealers. And so, the idea that this was this, racist conspiracy driven by, white lawmakers is just wrong. The idea that it constitutes the majority of our prison population is just wrong. The idea that these people can be adequately characterized as nonviolent offenders is just wrong.
You write, Barry, in your book on page 90, that Alexander writes in her book, quote, "Violent crime is not responsible for mass incarceration," but you point out that drug crimes explain only 13% of black state imprisonments, whereas violent crime accounts for 62%. But then you add, if we combine all black drug offenders, state and federal, drug sentences account for only 5.5% of the African Americans in prison. In other words, contrary to Alexander, more than 94 out of 100 African American prisoners, state and federal, are serving time for non-drug offenses.
Yeah.
And so I guess they have to ignore what you're writing.
I guess. I didn't make the numbers up. Those are numbers generated by the Bureau of Justice Statistics of the Justice Department. That's my source for most of this.
You both note in your books, and there's not a lot of overlap in your books, which I think makes them really good reads. You got to read both these books because they're very, very good.
Hoping you would say that.
I bet you were. That most crimes don't result in arrests. And of those that do, very few go to prison. And Barry, you write in your book, Raphael, that if the goal is to improve, quote, the quality of life in dangerous neighborhoods, the reality is that our criminal justice system sometimes, indeed often, fails to be harsh enough, unquote. And you included a chart that I want to show here. And I think this is from Barry's book. This is crimes resulting in imprisonment in 2019. Tell us about this chart, Barry, and then I want you to weigh in, Raphael.
It's kind of amazing, huh? Look at the number of people admitted to prison. Only murderers, where you have about half of the murderers admitted, are really punished for what they've done, seriously punished for what they've done. Now, let me explain these numbers. The number on the amount of crime is based on a survey of crime victims. And then the survey is pretty massive. I think it's 249,000 people or something like that, right? And then they project onto the whole country. So it's a pretty accurate count of the actual crime victimization in the United States. So that's the first column on the left. And then we know that most crime is not reported to the police Murder is the most reported because, of course, it involves a dead body. Stealing cars is also highly reported because the owner of the car has to report to collect from his insurance. But the other crimes are really not very well reported. So that's known to the police column, the second one from the left. The third one shows the arrests, okay, the number of people arrested, and the final column shows the number of people who are actually in prison. So that's pretty disturbing because once you go down the rows and you see that almost half of the murderers are in prison, you find numbers like 5%, 6%, 4%. And those are the realities.
And this comes from the 2019 National Crime Victimization Survey, which surveyed 249,000 people.
Yeah.
It's done by the Department of Justice. It's found on page 107 of your book.
The census folks also are involved in that. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think, again, sort of the theme of my book is that there's an incongruity between the dominant narrative and the reality, right? The dominant narrative is that criminal offenses are regularly met with harsh sentences of incarceration. The reality is that only 40% of state felony convictions result in a post-conviction sentence, meaning that 60% of state convictions are met with either sentences of probation, sentences of time served in pretrial detention, or some form of diversion. This is what the reality is. It's incongruous with what we're all told is happening on American streets and in American courtrooms. And what that tells us, again, is that if you look at the official conviction statistics, which we know are, sort of understate the severity of the criminal conduct engaged in, because the vast majority of cases are resolved via plea bargain. The vast majority of plea bargains involve some form of the following, which is either the downgrading of certain charges or the dropping of certain charges altogether. You look at this data, and what you have to conclude is that actually the vast majority of crime goes unpunished. Again, the vast majority of offenses are not reported to police. The vast majority of offenses reported to police are not cleared. Right? The FBI, up until very recently, would consistently report every year on clearance data, meaning how many of the reported crimes resulted in an arrest. If you look at the 8 index felonies that they track and just break them apart for violent and nonviolent, the 4 violent index felonies typically have a clearance rate on an annual basis of about 48%, meaning that more than half go unanswered for. If you look at the property index felonies, the clearance rate is only 18%, meaning the vast majority go unanswered for. And so when you look at, the sort of mass number of people in prison, what you have to understand is that that number has to be viewed in context, and the context is in the context of the people who are out on the street who should be in prison. That number, I fear, is much, much larger than the number of people in prison.
And you're not even talking about these so-called progressive prosecutors who've waved their regal wand and declared entire categories of crime, like theft and shoplifting, that they're not going to prosecute. You're talking about the garden variety criminal justice systems.
All the progressive prosecutor stuff is new. That's, cherry on top, which is, again, just sort of mind-boggling how we got to a point in which such large swaths of the public and policymakers have been convinced that, in fact, we have this mass punishment problem when, the reality is that we don't. And yet, again, despite all of the reforms that have happened in recent years, the New York Times reported last year that in the year after George Floyd's murder, 130 police reforms were passed across 40 states just in 1 year. And again, take the temperature of the reform movement today. Are they satisfied? Absolutely not. And so, I think we have to start, grappling with the potential that, a lot of what is presented as well-meaning reform is really just a slow march toward abolition and decarceration for its own sake. And then that begs the following question, which is, who is that going to be good for?
Yeah, and when you use the word abolition, I want everyone to understand what you're talking about. Angela Davis wrote a book, Are Prisons Obsolete? There is a prison abolitionist movement. Right. It's small, it's radical, but it's out there, and it infuses throughout a lot of these so-called reforms. Patrice Cullors, she's another one out there who is a devotee of Davis. You talk in your book on pages 94 through 96 in particular, but throughout the chapter, about use of force and police reforms. What are the chances of a police use of force occurring in the United States? And of those police-involved incidents, how many peace officers actually use lethal force?
Yeah, I mean, the numbers are far smaller than what you would be led to believe, again, if you were just a casual observer of the debate. The argument is that use of force is a very likely outcome of a police-citizen interaction, right? We see these terrible videos like George Floyd and other, encounters that don't look very good on film, and those are presented to us as, as if they are, sort of typical and representative of the of police-citizen interactions. The reality is that if you look at, deadly force, for example, I take data from 2018 and estimate that police officers in the United States fired their weapons an estimated 3,000 times or so. Sounds like a lot. It's about 8 shootings a day. It includes both fatal and non-fatal shootings. But when you contextualize that number in the context of the overall volume of police activity in a given year, things start to look very different. What do I mean by that? Well, we had 686,000 police officers in 2018. They made 10.3 million arrests, which means that if every shooting happened within the context of a separate arrest, you're talking about 0.03% of arrests involving the use of deadly force. Now, what about non-deadly force, right? That matters too. There's a study I point to in the book that looks at over 1 million calls for service over a 2-year period in 3 police departments, mid-sized police departments. One was in Louisiana, one was in North Carolina, the other one was in Arizona. Those 1 million calls for service led to 114,000 criminal arrests. Police officers used force in less than 1%. 1 out of every 128 of those arrests involved the use of any physical force whatsoever. And in 98% of the cases in which police officers used force in that study, there was no or mild injury to the suspect. Less than 2% of the time was there a serious injury. And in that entire data set, there is just 1 fatal police shooting captured. This, again, is completely incongruous with the narrative that we're all spoon-fed by the reform crowd. And I think it's done an incredible amount of damage insofar as it has led to the demonization of the institution of policing, and that demonization has led to people leaving the job, not taking the job, and the people who stay on the job becoming much less proactive than they otherwise would be, and that also contributes to the crime rise that I think we're all seeing today.
And when the local prosecutor announces to the public that they're not going to prosecute resisting arrest, which a lot of these progressive prosecutors don't prosecute, that gives a green light to people to resist arrest and more.
That's exactly right. And the other thing to understand about the progressive prosecutor movement is that it really took off, not necessarily as a means of, getting people out of prison and reforming the criminal justice system, but, the sort of first big domino to fall, which was the unseating of Robert McCullough in St. Louis County, was the function of the Michael Brown shooting, right? The idea was if you put me in office as a progressive prosecutor, Wesley Bell says, I'm going to reopen the investigation into the shooting of Michael Brown and hold police accountable. This was one of the primary messages that first got the progressive prosecutor movement off the ground in modern times. And, that also sends a message to police, which is that, hey, we're going to put you in legal jeopardy every chance that we get. And, again, it's not a good mix.
Yeah, I want to get to open it up to questions because I'm sure there are a lot of them. But Barry, I'm going to be very blunt. Okay, because this is really the gravamen of your book, that we don't have a so-called mass incarceration problem. And you hear from the other side, the U.S. has roughly 4% of the world's population, but holds 25% of the world's total prison population. Isn't that mass incarceration?
Well, you have to look at crime. Don't you have to look at crime if you're going to judge whether we're incarcerating too many people? If you don't look at crime, how can you answer that question? They don't look at crime. They don't want to know about crime rates. If you look at crime rates and then you look at incarceration, if you look at that graph that we had up there, that table that we had up there a bit earlier, how would you answer the question then? We don't over-incarcerate. We under-incarcerate, in fact. So I think without looking at crime and with only looking at crime at imprisonment rates, you give a false answer. You give a misleading answer. It's a ridiculous answer, really, isn't it? How can you talk about imprisonment rates and not talk about crime rates and assess whether those imprisonment rates are too high or not?
And what I like about your 2 books and our upcoming book in March on rogue prosecutors is that we're all pro-reform, right? And we don't think you're going to be able to prosecute and incarcerate your way out of these problems because these are large societal problems as well. you about to say something.
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to say, I mean, if you look at the crime numbers, it really does contextualize that reality that you pointed out. You know, again, context is everything, right? So if you want to look at the crime numbers in my book, I actually do an analysis where I look at 4 cities. I look at St. Louis, Chicago, Detroit, and Baltimore. And I just pick out a couple of neighborhoods in each of those cities, and I come out with a geographical area that houses about 475,000 people. And then I compare that area to all of England, all of Wales, and all of Germany, which have about 142 million people. And the area in the United States, again, just 475,000 people, 0.3% of the population in all of England, all of Wales, and all of Germany saw 10% of the homicides seen in all 3 of those countries combined, right? Which, and just 4 American cities, not even the entire cities, just a couple of handfuls of the neighborhoods, right? So when you look at the incarceration disparity on an international level, you have to take account of that reality, and you also have to take account of the fact that the United States is a rich country. Part of the reason why we're an outlier on incarceration is that we have the resources to dedicate to an effective criminal justice apparatus that can suss out crime, that can prosecute it, and that has the capacity to house people in prison. I mean, look at Brazil's homicide rate compared to the United States. It's not that they don't want to put people in prison, they just don't have the same resources that we do. And that matters too. And so again, just, you know, the sort of the 2 themes is the incongruity and also the lack of context.
And you have a great chart in your book comparing U.S. imprisonment rates for the specific crimes with European countries and Australia, which I encourage folks to look at when they get your book.
Yeah.
So I want to open it up for questions. The only rules we have are state your name and your affiliation and actually ask a question, no speechifying. So let me start here in the front.
Hi, Deborah Weiss.
Hold on, wait for the microphone because we want to make sure we hear you loud and clear.
Hi, Deborah Weiss, and I used to be an appellate attorney for the prosecution on juvenile criminals. Regarding your comment that it's not really mass incarceration because they're out on the streets and not incarcerated, I was wondering if you could talk about how it's not really mass either, because to me, mass conjures up the image of you're en masse railed, and it's really individuals. And the second thing I just wanted to ask quickly was, since you were saying that it's not racist if you look at the numbers, I agree with that, but I've had so many people say, well, the actual numbers of the crimes probably aren't any different. It's just that the black people keep getting arrested more. If you could adjust those 2 comments.
Yeah, so, you know, the idea that black arrests, you know, are somehow disproportionate to the crime, there's no basis in data for that. I mean, again, look at homicide victimization, which often mirrors homicide commission. Black Americans, black men, constitute about 7% of the nation's population and close to 50% of all homicide victims. There's, you know, that is mirrored by the homicide offending data. In New York City, 97% of shooting victims last year were either black or Latino. Almost all of them were shot by other blacks and Latinos. So, you know, the reality is that there's not disproportionality. But the thing that frustrates me the most about this sort of systemic racism argument is that they pretend as if the only output of the criminal justice system is enforcement statistics. And there's a complete other side to the ledger, and that is crime declines. And again, if you look at the, you know, I will readily admit that blacks and Latinos disproportionately bear the costs associated with the operation of the criminal justice system, which is to say that they're more likely to be on the enforcement end of the equation. However, they also disproportionately enjoy the benefits associated with enforcement, and that comes in the form of crime declines. When you consider the concentration of crime, the geographic concentration, the demographic concentration, I don't think you can come away with the conclusion that the system is racist.
You're probably right. It's not mass either. I'm going to use that. I'll give you a footnote.
We're over here.
Delano Squires. I'm a research fellow here at Heritage Foundation. Prior to that, I spent my last year in D.C. government. I was in D.C. government over a decade. Last year with the Office of Gun Violence Prevention. So I'm curious, what do you all, it's a 2-part question, 2 related parts. What do you all make of gun violence prevention programs and sort of the trend of treating gun violence as a public health issue? And then related, what do you all make in the rise in firearm ownership and concealed carry requests, also oftentimes in the very neighborhoods that are experiencing the crime spikes?
Yeah, I mean, so I would point you to the work of my colleague on the last part of your question, Robert Verburgen at the Manhattan Institute, who's done some, really good research looking into the relationship between the buildup in concealed carry and the buildup in gun ownership, and its potential effects on crime. And you don't actually really see a relationship. I mean, one of the things to remember is that we had this massive decline in serious violence, including gun violence, over the course of the 1990s and early 2000s. That's also a period in which gun ownership exploded in this country, in which gun rights were significantly expanded, in which gun laws at the state level were liberalized in really meaningful ways. The other thing that's complicated is that, again, violent crime, gun crime in particular, is very hyper-concentrated geographically. What you don't see when you zoom in is a clear relationship to where that gun ownership buildup is happening and where the gun crime is happening. Now, what I make of the gun violence prevention programs, I think that exploration and research is important, and we should monetize at every opportunity. But I think what a lot of these efforts are characterized by is an unwillingness to admit the uncomfortable truth that any gun violence prevention program with a snowball's chance in Miami of succeeding is going to have to put enforcement as the tip of the spear. There is a just fundamental discomfort with the idea that policing and incarceration are going to play significant roles in the reduction of gun violence. When you look at a city like Chicago and you look at someone who's charged with a homicide or a shooting, these are almost always people who are repeat offenders. The average number of arrests for someone charged with a homicide or shooting in Chicago is 12. 1 in 5 have more than 20 prior arrests. What that tells you is that the major failure driving gun violence in this country is a failure to draw a line and enforce it with respect to repeated criminal conduct. That's where I think the effort has to start.
In my opinion, that's true for all of the interventions. Unless the intervention is backed up by a threat of punishment and incarceration, it's not going to be effective because people won't show up, they won't do the job, they won't do what they're supposed to do unless there's the fear of going to prison or back to prison. So the interventions might work, but they need to have backup, and the backup has to be a threat of punishment. And by the way, in general, the whole problem with these people who want to abolish prisons is they don't have any alternative. What's their idea of how to handle crime, right? See, their answer is really a kind of broad political argument that what we need to do is eliminate poverty or reduce poverty substantially, and then crime will go down, okay? And then we won't need prisons. That's really where they're going with this. Well, fine, I'm in favor of eliminating poverty too. That would be great. And if society were more affluent, you would reduce violent crime. I agree with that too. But of course, we don't agree on how to achieve those ends either.
We have time for one very quick last question.
Okay, I'll make it quick. I'm Pete Newsham. I served as a police officer here in Washington, D.C. From 1989 to 2021, the last 4 as the chief here. Currently the chief of police in Prince William County in Virginia. This is a curiosity question. Have you been viciously and personally attacked for sharing your thoughts and views on these issues? And I say that because I think that's a tactic that's being used to silence these ideas.
I have. I try not to pay attention to it, although I did receive a rather disturbing death threat before a talk recently and actually had to have a police escort, which was a bit embarrassing, walking around with 2 big guys with guns behind me. But, look, I understand that if you're going to participate in a public debate like this, there's going to be backlash. At the end of the day, the risk that I face is nothing close to the risk that people living in, communities where crime concentrates are facing. And that's really what motivates my work, at the end of the day.
I only go to heritage invitations and Manhattan Institute invitations. I'm sad, right. No, I can't go back to John Jay anymore. They're in trouble now. They've gone horrible.
Well, look, this has been a fantastic discussion. Appreciate you attending. And please join me in thanking our guests.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well done.